Okay, world history students, we're going to take a look at a kind of complicated time in Chinese history that follows the period of European colonialism, and in many ways, European colonialism never ends. Uh, their imperial projects and behavior after the Opium War, it only kind of ramps up in China. But like I said in the last lecture, the Qing dynasty doesn't go away, at least initially. It just sort of lives in this limbo with Europeans controlling much of the countryside and economy. So this period we're going to be looking at today is called Late Imperial and Pre-Revolutionary China. It's kind of a kind of blurry time period from like the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s. So the key thing I want you to realize about this time period is that the Qing dynasty is, while it's still in power officially, it's losing its grip over much of the countryside. It's actually a really tumultuous time period. There's a number of huge rebellions during this time. One is called the Taiping Rebellion, another is called the Boxer Rebellion. And if we had more time, we would pursue those, but those were extremely bloody affairs that in terms of loss of life and death, they're one of the most bloody conflicts in human history. And this is all happening as the Qing dynasty is losing control of China to the Europeans. It's all kind of happening at the same time, late 1800s, early 1900s. The Qing dynasty, as I've said before, it's the last dynasty to rule China. It's another name for the Qing dynasty is the Manchu dynasty. It's in slow decline by the mid-1800s. In many cases, a lot of the countryside, they start resenting Western imperialism. They resent the British and the Dutch and the French and the Germans and the Americans and even the Japanese who are going to become participants in carving up China for their own economic gain, even though China still retains its national boundaries. There's mistreatment of peasants that is going on under the Qing dynasty. That's really nothing new. That kind of happens in all peasant-based agricultural societies. There's corruption. There's conflict over religious beliefs. One of the things that Westerners, Europeans, bring with them is Christianity. Christian missionaries are going to be a source of conflict within late Qing dynasty China. As you remember, these are the kind of spheres of influence, areas in which the different European powers influenced and controlled Chinese economy. This is the last of the Qing dynasty monarchs. Her name is the Empress Dowager. She had the distinction of being the last emperor figure or empress in the Qing dynasty, and she rules up until the early 1900s, until 1911. And she had the distinction of ruling in kind of a very decadent, out-of-touch way. One famous story, just to toss out there to you, is she spent an obscene amount of money on frivolous personal expenditures like this boat that you see here. Now, that's not actually a boat. It's a marble palace in the shape of a boat, but this costs the equivalent of large chunks of the military budget that the Empress Dowager devoted to this frivolous project. And it kind of shows you just where the Qing dynasty's priorities were, especially towards the end. So there is a revolution in China finally. By 1911, the Qing dynasty finally is overthrown. There's a nationalist movement, a movement to try and reunify China and to strengthen it and kind of push out old ways. It's led by a charismatic and highly intellectual leader named Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen, who you see here off to the right, he's one of the most interesting revolutionary figures in world history. He's not so much a military figure as he is an intellectual who really believes firmly that China could not only be reunified, but it could be reunified on the basis of democracy and prosperity for all. And this is a really hopeful vision that Dr. Sun Yat-sen has. He's the founder of the Chinese Nationalist Party, which the name for it is the Kuomintang. And it's going to become the kind of forerunner to the Chinese Nationalist Party that will continue even after Dr. Sun's death. He's Japanese American educated, and he brings a lot of Western ideas about democracy and equal representation and tolerance in society. And his goal is to kind of have that for China. And this is in the early 1900s. He has the three principles of the people pledge. Basically, he's committing himself to a free China, free from foreign control and internal violence, warlords, something we'll talk about in a second, democracy, as well as to develop an economy for everyone. So he believes in kind of the improvement of all Chinese lives, rich and poor, across the social spectrum. And this is a really ambitious vision that Dr. Sun has. But he has the misfortune of kind of colliding his rule with a lot of internal problems in China. The Qing dynasty had lost its grip over much of the country, and much of the country was not in the hands of Dr. Sun and the Kuomintang and these ambitious hopes to reunify China. It was in the hands of what were called warlords. These were essentially military figures who had their own private armies who controlled chunks of the countryside. This is a really messy situation China finds itself in. The new Republic of China was weak. It was unable to have a coherent, unified administration. So most of the day-to-day lives of people, especially if you get into the internal countryside of China, it's going to be in the hands of these various warlords. The Chinese countryside, it falls into the hands of these people, and they're not really willing to give up that power. And in many ways, they brutalize the people, they force people into the army, they steal things from people, they prop up their own personal wealth at the expense of the public. They hold a lot of military power, so you can order people and push people around once you have the power of guns and the military. They establish some attempts at regional governments, and there's some attempts at cooperation between the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, and various warlords, but sometimes that breaks down. It's, like I said, a very messy situation. Massive corruption, and in many cases, the warlord era is characterized by exploiting the local peasants. You guys read some of those accounts in the traditional China reading of even into the 20th century, just how bad Chinese peasants had it. Well, this spills on into the warlord era, and those people who are so vulnerable are even more vulnerable when you throw in the existence of these warlords. We see these images from the early 20th century of how China was kind of carved up by different warlords. I want to read you one of these accounts here. This is from a history on China, from a book called Revolution and Its Past, and it's basically a composite history of China. But this is one account of the warlord era. Listen to this. Some warlords perhaps actually had the abilities, character, and potential to unite the Chinese nations and become a head of state. Others, for example, Feng Xuang, a self-taught Christian convert, indoctrinated his troops with Christian and Chinese values and was said to baptize his troops with a fire hose. One of the more notorious was Zhang Zhongchang, the dog meat general. A journalist described him as having the physique of an elephant, the brain of a pig, and the temperament of a tiger. In his Shandong military troops included 4,000 white Russians and a unit of several thousand boys whose average age was 10, were notorious for their practice of opening melons, that is, splitting skulls and hanging strings of human heads on telegraph poles. This is the level of brutality that you could see on a regular basis in the warlord era. I wanted to make sure you had that description. Here's one other kind of historical description of it. This is also from the same text source. Ignore the task at the bottom. You don't need to do that. Warlords like Wu, Feng, and Yan, others had lesser goals. Some regional, some local. Some warlords were simply thuggish. Warlords striving for national power often put together coalitions in order to have a greater troop strength and a broader availability of resources. Some such coalitions were, by their nature, unstable. For most often, they were formed as part of a strategy to accomplish short-term or intermediate goals. Among the warlord players on the national level, coalitions did not have an ideological basis, nor were they based upon close personal connections. A frequent pattern, today's ally may be tomorrow's enemy. One method to destroy coalitions was by assassinating members. Reportedly, a common approach was to invite the proposed victim to a banquet where he was then murdered. Again, the brutality and uncertainty of this era is the thing I want you to take away. Out of this warlord China emerged two possible solutions, and this is what I want to leave you with today. You have the Kuomintang that was founded by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, but Dr. Sun dies. He dies in the 1920s. He never really has a chance to bring about his vision. He is succeeded by a charismatic military figure named Chiang Kai-shek, and I'd like you to remember his name. He's going to be an important figure in Chinese history. He is supported by the West, by the United States of America, for instance. Western bankers, anyone who's not a communist. Chiang Kai-shek, if there's one thing I want you to remember about him now, he is anti-communist. And he has some of the followers of Dr. Sun and a lot of military leaders who were loyal to Dr. Sun. So he has a lot of hope and possibilities when he first takes over. He has a limited commitment to democracy, although he will mouth the words that suggest he's in favor of a democracy, as Dr. Sun was. The next vision that will emerge out of this period of warlord China is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. This is led by a young ex-librarian named Mao Zedong, another very important figure in Chinese history who will become even more important. He is an early player in the Communist Party movement in China. There is a movement called the May 4th movement in 1919, which essentially unified the Communist Party and presented it as an alternative vision for how China could be unified. The communists, like they often do in communist movement that we've studied so far, they favor things like land redistribution, collectivization, and taking back China from foreign powers. Everybody's kind of on board with that idea. And for a while, these two briefly cooperate to defeat the warlords. The warlords are just that bad. And they form what is called the First United Front in the 1920s. So by the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, they're two competing visions for China, one communist, one not communist, and these two are going to continue to vie for the leadership of China as we move forward. I'd like you to make sure that you take notes on this and be able to use it for the task that awaits you on Monday.